Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy has sent a destroyer close to a contested island in the South China Sea that China has fortified with military installations to stake its territorial claims on the region. The U.S. action came as the Chinese military entered a third day of a show of force around Taiwan, 1,000 miles away near the northern entrance to the South China Sea. A statement from the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet says the guided missile destroyer passed within 12 nautical miles, the internationally recognized limit of a nation's territorial waters. For a deeper look at the ongoing cross-border tension between China and Taiwan and the possible implications, a lecturer of political and international relations of the Liverpool Hope University, Dr. Bola Adeniran, joins me on the news from the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for joining us on World Now. What's your reading of the current tensions between China and Taiwan?
Well, this is not a surprising move by China. Remember that last year, a similar round of exercise was launched after Nancy Pelosi and the Taiwanese president met. In fact, that particular episode was much more much more aggressive. There were missiles and launched from China into the waters near Taiwan. So this is not particularly surprising. In fact, what has been surprising this year actually is the smaller scale of the simulated attacks by China. Last year, it was much grander, it was much bigger, and then there was a much more aggressive tone by China. This year, there has been a much more calm approach by China to the crisis. Having said that, however, I think that there is also indication that China is simulating combat readiness in a much more detailed way compared to last August when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. So, as I said, it's not unusual because this has always been China's response to any kind of attempt to move the status quo on the Taiwan Straits.
So, do you think these,
in terms of increasing the likelihood of conflict between both countries, don't also forget that China and under Xi Jinping sort of moved forward and changed their strategy in regards to Taiwan. Previously, under previous leaders, China was baiting and biding its time, to put it very clearly. But under Xi Jinping, there has been a dramatic change in the strategy. Xi Jinping has talked about the Chinese dream, the rejuvenation of China, and he believes that all of that has to be completed before 2030 or possibly 2050 at the latest. All of those things make it very difficult for China to accept any other kind of resolution to the crisis. It has decided that if Taiwan is not incorporated into its sphere of influence in a diplomatic manner, it is willing to embrace and to use the threat of force and possibly force to annex Taiwan. So obviously, this increases the possibility of conflict over Taiwan. In terms of its impact on world peace, I think that this does not augur well for the international community, obviously on the back of what is happening in Ukraine. So there is certainly some concern at that front.
Amazing. So some experts have actually suggested that China's aggressive actions towards Taiwan are part of a larger effort to expand its influence in the region. Do you agree with this assessment?
Well, I think that China is beginning to act obviously like a world power, like a superpower that it is. Don't forget that, as I said, every Chinese leader has foreign policy perspectives and agenda that determines how China engages with the rest of the world. Xi Jinping over the last few months has launched a 24-character Chinese foreign policy that is considered a bit more aggressive than previous presidents. In fact, rather than the previous attempt to beat their time in terms of announcing their entrance into the world stage as a superpower, China is willing to take much more aggressive actions to announce itself on the world stage. And obviously, we're seeing China also take much more settlement between Iran and Saudi Arabia just a couple of weeks ago. And there are indications that it's also opening itself up to not only Russia, but also even France. The French president was in China only recently. So yes, China is becoming much more aggressive on the international stage, if we could put it that way, or as the Chinese would want to put it, that they're willing to take their place in the world, and whether that involves Africa with their Belt and Road Initiative and their investment opportunity, their investment within African states, or even within the South China Sea, where they are taking more aggressive actions. I think that it is clear that China is very comfortable with its new posture as a superpower.
So, can you provide some more insight into how the international community is responding to the current situation, specifically how you think China will react to the US's involvement in the situation?
I think that China is very aware that under the agreement that the US had with China in the 70s and the 80s, that the US will continue to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself, but at the same time also maintain some form of strategic ambiguity over how it will respond to a possible invasion by China. So China is quite aware that, number one, there is a US policy that obligates it to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself. But under President Biden, the US has moved from the sort of the strategic ambiguity policy that it had for decades, where it does not commit itself to either helping to come to the aid of Taiwan in the case of an aggressive attack by Taiwan or not. But what I think is going to happen is that China, as it becomes a much more established military power, it's an established economic power, but as it grows in stature as a military power, it is not going to matter whether the US, commits to supporting Taiwan or not, because as I said, for the Chinese, it is important that Taiwan be reunified with China. There is no if or buts about it. There is no gray area. Taiwan has to be incorporated into Chinese sphere of influence. And it is just a matter of time. And the Chinese are quite aware that they have all the time to accomplish this.
Interesting. So are there any diplomatic solutions that could be pursued to prevent further escalation? I mean, what steps can be taken to de-escalate tensions between China and Taiwan?
I think the first part of it is for the US to particularly recognize that China is no longer the China of the 70s and the 80s that could be bullied, right? And to go back into the kind of policy that they had previously, where the one China policy, where US officials are not expanding the range of their diplomatic engagement with China. I think that's going to, in many ways, lessen the tone of the aggressive actions by either side. So the US should go back to the one China policy, recognize China's sovereignty over Taiwan. That would definitely placate some tensions. But at the same time, I think that there has to be much more diplomatic engagement. And it's unfortunate that we're getting into the 1930s, 1940s kind of way of engaging in international relations, where it is more about show of power than talking at the round table. We've seen how that has turned out in Ukraine. But if a conflict between China US actually occurs, it's going to be bad for the world, much more than it's bad the way that Russia's incursion into Ukraine has been bad for the world. We're going to see massive economic recession across the world, including in places like Africa, because of the extensive range of Chinese influence, economic influence in places like Nigeria. So there is a need for more robust diplomatic engagement that has to recognize, one, that China sees Taiwan as an inseparable part of it, and number two, that also calls for level-headed calmness and deeper and robust diplomatic engagements over areas of discontent between US and China. I think that is the only way forward, really.
Very quickly before I let you go, because it does appear that, when they said when two elephants fight, the grass suffers. We don't know exactly which is the other elephant here. Maybe it is China and the United States and Taiwan with the grass. But then, do you see China assuming the superpower in just few years to come? Let's say a few decades to come. The way US is positioned, do you see China moving to that level as overtaking the United States, especially with the currency that is, Russia moving away from the US dollar, saying that they want to be spending yuan? How do you see this play out in nearest future?
I think that there is a shift. There is a brewing shift in the globe, in the international order that we're beginning to see now. Whether it's going to crystallize into something concrete depends on a number of factors that nobody has control over. You're very correct that there is a sort of de-dollarization scheme that is going on, and many states within the global south are beginning to latch on that. Don't also forget that the BRICS are, for example, suggesting a common currency amongst them, and that could be a game changer in some ways. What I want to actually mention is that China is a superpower now. It is an economic superpower. It's the second largest economy globally. And there are indications that by 2030, it might overtake the US under some certain indices. By 2050, obviously, there is an acceptance that China would be the largest economy if it's not done that by 2030. So economically, China is a superpower already. Where China needs to catch up is in terms of soft diplomacy, so soft power in terms of getting more friends and bringing more people, more countries into its circle of influence.
Absolutely.
And lastly, in terms of its military capacity, China needs to be a military power to to overtake the US. And when that is done, I think that obviously we would see a change of that within the international system.
That would be very nightmarish for the United States, to hear or to come to terms to this realization. A lecturer of political and international relations of the Liverpool Hope University, Dr. Bola Adeniran. Thank you so much for your keenness of insight, as always.